Hi, this is Alejandra again. I'm writing over at Talk Film Society, and you can find me on Twitter at sick__66.
And I'm not going to censor out your name this time.
What went we out into this wilderness to find? Leaving our country, kindred, our fathers' houses. For what? For the kingdom of God. Let us pray.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk About Movies. Today on the show, again, I'm joined by Alejandra. Thank you again for coming back. We had an interesting discussion on Twitter when I was asking people about their favorite slow burn horror. And you
attacked you.
You called me a fraud and a liar, and you were disgraced to know me because I brought this up. No, but you had an interesting perspective on that. And in our discussion today, we're going to be talking about Robert Eggers' 2016 film, The Witch. But you had some thoughts on my description. Would you like to get into that?
Yes. So I felt like an asshole, first and foremost, because I didn't ever... I felt like I was attacking you, which I never would because you're the best.
Don't worry about it. Oh, thank you.
But I have a specific reaction when people say slow burn in regards to a movie that's a little bit more slowly paced. Only because it's typically followed by, I didn't really like it. It was too much of a slow burn for me. And it just gets under my skin because that kind of perpetuates this notion that any film that is kind of moderately paced is to be equated as being boring or anticlimactic or whatever. And I just don't agree with that.
I can understand that. I can totally see that. And yeah, we talked about it a little bit, and I thought that'd be a great way to lead into an episode about something that I would consider that. And, I just never really came at it from that approach. I haven't been a huge horror fan my whole life. I'm a recent convert from the last couple years. Yeah. When I was younger, I just got scared. And then as I got older, I was like, oh, they're all, who cares? Jump scares, blah. That really generic, kind of casual approach to movies.
You thought it wasn't stimulating.
Yeah, I didn't get it, and now I'm happy to say at least I know what I like more now, and now I'm obsessed. I'm really looking forward to stuff like Midsummer. I loved Us a lot. I've been recording podcasts about different things, and I just keep bringing up how much I loved Jordan Peele's Us. So sorry if I bring it up 5 dozen times during this episode too.
I think that is actually going to be a really interesting case because I feel like the first half was definitely a little bit of a slow burn. I'm gonna by the way, just for the sake of this episode, use the term, but I would typically say moderately paced or just slowly paced. I don't know. I wouldn't use the word slow. I would just use moderate. But anyway, the beginning of that movie was very, very moderately paced. But then it had this switch where it suddenly was 100 miles an hour. I feel like it went from 0 to 60 in no time, and I kind of love that. I feel like that happens in The Witch too, but I feel like a bigger bulk of The Witch is moderately paced and then goes from 0 to 60 in the last act. But it's just I really do like when films do that.
Yeah, I do too. I'm not going to talk about which movie specifically, but there's another movie coming up that I was privy to read the script for, and I got really excited about it because it's just it doesn't hit you with anything until the last 15 minutes of the movie, and I'm really excited to see how people react to that. But for The Witch, so I saw this movie in theaters opening weekend, having not heard a lot about it. And,
okay.
And all I saw from the little Twitter trailers was a goat. And so I went in completely blind, and I came out shocked, terrified, certain images just seared into my brain. I had never even heard of this Robert Eggers guy. I don't think most people had. what was your first experience with The Witch?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so this might be a little bit of an extended story.
By all means, we got more time this time, so.
Yes, we do. Okay, so I actually was not very well versed in like the festival circuit horror like world, so I actually didn't know about this, but I went on a date and the guy was like, oh yeah, there's like this amazing movie that's gonna come out called The Witch, and I'm like, oh my god, that sounds so lame, like be more specific, please. And so he showed me the trailer, and then I was like, oh, that is extremely my shit, but for some reason I never went to go watch it, so I actually have never seen The Witch on the big screen.
Ooh.
Which sucks because it is legitimately one of my favorite movies of the 21st century, period. But my first time watching it was, wow. I had never liked anything like it, if you know what I mean. It was the first of its type that I completely fell in love with. And I would say that it was the first really, really moderately paced horror film that I fell in love with. And then I saw House of the Devil, which is another answer I gave you when you asked that question on Twitter. And it does the same exact thing. And now it's kind of one of my favorite styles of filmmaking.
Yeah, I actually saw House of the Devil, like, relatively soon after I saw The Witch for the first time, too. And that's another really good one. Here's a little extra thing. Before we get into, like, divvying up the movie and, like, all the weird imagery and, like, the ideas and shit, the moment it ended, I saw it with my friend and co-host, Gene. We stood up, I got out of the theater, and I realized, oh, my nose is really runny. That's weird. It must be allergies or something.
Are you talking about right now or in the movies?
At the end of the movie. And
okay.
So I was like, that's weird. Okay, whatever. And as I'm walking out, I'm like, that's a lot. Oh my God. And then this blood just started gushing out of my nose.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah. The moment the movie ended, I got like a profuse nosebleed and I had to be in the bathroom for like half an hour. I felt like such a nerd. And I was like, that was
the power of the film.
That scared the shit out of me. And so then I'm like, okay, that was a scary movie, but whatever. So a couple months passed, obviously. I'm hanging out with another group of friends. Like, oh, I heard The Witch is really good. And I was like, yeah, I got a nosebleed after. That was weird, though. Oh, whatever. We watched the movie. Not everyone fell in love with it. Then the movie ends, and then my nose starts running again.
No, stop it.
I swear to God.
I don't believe you.
No, this is true. This is true. I've been saying it since it happened. I think The Witch cursed me. I haven't seen it since. I've only seen it twice.
Do not watch it a third time.
To watch it a third time.
No, third time's the charm. Like, I'm scared for you. Do not watch it ever
like
again.
Some Beetlejuice situation.
That is really terrifying.
I genuinely don't know what will happen if I watch it again.
If you're listening to this and you've had a paranormal experience after watching The Witch, let us know, because I want to confirm that this is a cursed film for all men.
Yeah, please. Like, maybe that's it, you know? Like,
because I feel on top of the world when I watch this movie.
Okay, so that's my favorite reading ever about this movie. That it might be the greatest film about joining a sorority ever made.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, if you could, I think you could equate, being a witch with being in a sorority. Sure.
So, like, again, on this show, I don't really like to divvy up, like, too much of the plot stuff, but I think it's kind of important for at least the beginning of this film, where it's this, like, heavily religious Protestant family who are too, like, intense for even, like, the village that they're a part of. They have to go off and be, like, their own kind of sect out in nature. And it's really about, like, how the trappings of, like, this society and this religion so, like, restrictive and confined that it's basically, like, destroying these people from the inside out. Specifically, the young woman, Thomason. Mm-hmm. And, like, this patriarchal society's driving them crazy. And how maybe the witch is, like, the one with, like, the most agency in the film. Or at least, like, self-realized agency.
I think... Okay, so I would like to consider myself a resident witch expert.
Oh, yes, please.
Or witch and film expert, anyway. And a lot of times, witches are used in film as a vessel for, feminism or feminist ideas expressed in film. So I think that this film is obviously a feminist film through and through. And of course it uses the witch to represent that agency and that kind of like break away from the patriarchy, which is literally her father. So we could talk about witch movies all day, but let's talk about the witch.
Boo! There you are. Boo!
This is where I have a question about that. Then, so her father is obviously like the big symbol of the patriarchy that kind of ends up eating away at the family,
right?
And then Black Phillip is still a male figurehead,
right?
So is that like her seeing that as like the coven as like as an escape, but still not really because there's still a male figurehead at the end there, or is that still something more open?
Okay, so oh my god, you're gonna send me down a rabbit hole here.
No, please, by all means.
So I don't know if you have seen The Love Witch.
I have.
But one of the commentary, but like one of the things that it touches upon is how she is seeking this liberation and she feels liberated at some points, but she still has to do these like sexual rituals to a man that's part of the coven that she is a part of. So she's still being submissive to this man that's in her coven. So I feel like both of these movies are kind of, and they both came out around the same time as well. I think they're both speaking to how there will always be a looming kind of patriarchal like force influencing our lives, because there's no way, I mean, at least myself as a woman, I know there's no way I'm ever going to live in a world where there are no men. That unfortunately. But so I think you're right. I didn't even think about that. I think that's really interesting that she does get this agency, but it's still kind of given to her by a male figure.
Yeah, it made me think of like, because obviously it's a very like religious focused film, you know, not so much about like embracing, well, I guess it's about embracing faith, but not through the common like interpretation of it. I'd say it's very much like about the way faith could like shape people for better and far, far, far worse. And so I think that's really interesting, like this idea of free will that so many religions touch upon, and how maybe that's not, free will is not inherently something that is free, you know, or maybe not something that's chosen. It's chosen for you. You don't get to really decide, and that kind of cosmic terror is really unnerving to me.
I mean, it's not free. I mean, she had to pay a price for that free will, if you will, you know? Mm-hmm. And also, somebody is giving you that permission, like, or some force or energy or whatever is giving you that free will, but they can still also take it away. And I think that's the case of Black Phillip. Actually, Black Phillip is like one of the more terrifying figures in horror to me ever. So that's interesting. I actually also don't really, when I watch this, I don't think about religion at all, to be honest. I mean, besides the obvious plot of the film, but I don't think like, oh, this is so about spirituality and like the confinements of religion at all.
Oh, I mean, I think that might be my own reading into it. I was raised Catholic.
Right.
I'm still working my own things out with that. So that might be. That's good, though. But
well, I'm also raised Catholic, but I don't know if you were more like active in your practicing of it. But I also think that it's because since I am a woman, like what I see is, again, religion as a vessel of the patriarchy. So I think they're just using this like storyline as a way to kind of introduce the dynamic between the family and why the father has these beliefs that he has and why a lot of the people in this period had those beliefs. And I was on a podcast actually recently in February called XOXO Horror by Joe Lipset from Bloody Disgusting. And we talked about the witch, and I told him that I feel like if I saw this with a guy, his interpretation would be completely different than my interpretation.
I wouldn't say we're completely different, but I think we do have different perspectives just because, you know, I'm part of the patriarchy unintentionally, but it is something that, you know, I have to be wary of.
Do you find this to be a tragedy, or do you find this to be more of an uplifting story?
Weirdly enough, I think it can be classified as both, because she
Okay.
finally has freedom, and even though her family was bad for her, she still has to deal with the death of her siblings, who were young enough to maybe be to grow into that own freedom. But I have complex feelings on it. I think it's a bit of both, but she is ultimately more free at the end of the film than she ever would have been with her family.
I found it more uplifting than it's tragic, which concerns me about myself.
No, okay. So I've been fascinated with this movie since I saw it, and I feel comfortable saying you're absolutely right in that the perspectives of a man and a woman watching this film are very different, because many women I've noticed have found it more uplifting than anything, and what that tells me is that I still got a lot of work to do in my life and about the way I view things, and probably a lot of other men too. Because if we're saying like, oh no, it's like that's a scary ending as opposed to uplifting, then maybe we got to open up our perspectives a little bit more.
When I talk to guys about this movie, I always ask what, like, if they have siblings, what kind of their like family dynamic was and what their responsibilities were in that dynamic when they were younger, because I think that also colors how you watch this film. Because me, as the eldest daughter, I had the responsibility of also being a mother and being an example and still being submissive to both my parents, especially being Hispanic. And every time I knew I was right in a place where they were wrong, my dad wouldn't listen to me, but like, here comes my little brother and he is acting up or acting a certain way that's unacceptable for me to behave, and he gets nothing of reprimanding at all. So I feel like that happens a lot in this film too, and there are expectations held of her that are not put on other members of the family, especially her little brother. And so that really resonated with me, because that kind of, you can only take so much of that, and I think that's what makes, and that's what drives the witch, honestly, the tension that continues to grow and grow because she's just having enough of how she's being treated and the expectations that are put on her by her father.
I mean, there's only so much I can like understand of that. I could empathize, but obviously, I have no siblings. I'm an only child, and two, I grew up male, so I didn't have the pressures that you had, and so I think I just have to be more understanding of that. But I am unfortunately aware of the specifically the Latin approach to raising kids, and you guys do get the short end of the stick more often than
Yes.
not. And
It's awful.
it's worse than a double standard. It's still unfortunately very prevalent in people in our age group, and unfortunately even younger.
Which I think is why I'm so obsessed with this movie, because I hate period pieces. I'm just gonna be honest.
Whoa.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of period pieces. Like, I mean, that's a very broad statement. There are some that I love, but I really didn't think I was gonna like this because I'm not into like the Old English or the Middle English or whatever you want to call it.
It's older than us.
And
It's
B,
old.
yes, exactly. It's Old English. And B, I also just don't like movies that are like, I don't like The Crucible and things like that. So for me to go into this and have come out loving it, it definitely is because I felt such a strong identification with Thomasin that I thought was still relevant today. And I think, it's made in a way that it demands to be relatable.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, that might be where the real horror comes in, because we're discussing whether it's uplifting or tragic. I think the real tragedy is just the fact that it is still a relatable experience, specifically to women. Because again, it's what you're saying is a common thread in a lot of female criticism of the film. So I think that's very unfortunate, and I think a lot of guys got to take a hard look at maybe the state of things harder, because we're not doing great right now. So maybe everyone take 5 for a little bit and kind of figure out why this is. As we got stuff to work on, in case people haven't noticed.
It's funny because I saw this for the first time around, believe it or not, it was a little bit after it was released. It was around like the election. Oh. And not to get political or anything.
No, by all means, please.
It was around the election time, and this film deals with hysteria and like obviously has some influence of the witch trials and stuff. And I found this to be super crazy because the way that Thomasin gets treated by her family, I feel like Hillary was being treated by the whole country. And so I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, the way that women are scrutinized when they act a certain way and are called either like a bitch or, in Thomasin's case, a witch, it's just so unfair. And so that whole like hysterical element was super interesting to watch during the election time. I don't know, this movie takes me back.
I don't know if that's a place I want to be taken back to.
No, I'm like, wow, what we didn't know at that point.
I know, Jesus Christ, I know that whole like time period was just fucking brutal and draining,
and it's been brutal ever since.
Yeah, it's like it's just gotten worse somehow. It's gotten more stressful and like draining. I don't know how any of us are like still alive given the emotional turmoil we deal with every day now.
Well, I mean, that's why it was so cathartic to watch Thomasin break away from it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, you totally won me over with all this already, by the way. Like, I'm 100% on board with, like, the uplifting ending. This is what we gotta be doing. We just gotta burn down our homes and move into the woods and break away from the patriarchy.
Into the woods. And, exactly, and sacrifice babies.
That's the one thing I'm like, maybe still not on board with the uplifting thing. Because, okay, I kind of want to get into this other side of the discussion, too. Along with I'll just go ahead and label it the slow burn controversy. There's also the notorious controversy that always hits horror films. Is it really a horror, or is it a psychological thriller?
Oh, Jesus, I want to punch everybody in the goddamn face.
I'll join you, because that's just ridiculous.
Honestly, at this point, I am sick of both sides. Like, I just want the conversation to end.
I'm sorry to bring it up then.
No. I love having this conversation because I love to show people that horror can be not what you expect it to be. And it's just, like, I just don't want it. Like, it's happened so often now that I'm just so tired of it. But I'm down to talk about it because the other day when I went to go watch Us, my friend... Tiffany, if you're listening, I'm calling you out. She goes, honestly, loved that, but it wasn't horror. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, are you joking right now? And so I explained to her that there need not be demons or, I mean, in this case it's different, but there need not be demons or jump scares or ghosts or like any of that stuff for it to be a horror movie. Like, I think what makes a horror movie is, to me, very subjective. So I really do think anything can be a horror film. Like, I think Gone Girl is a horror film. But I think it has a lot to do with atmosphere and the tone and I don't know. Like, I think it's clear when something is a horror movie. 100%. And to say that The Witch is not a horror movie... it's just upsetting. Like, I'm so mad right now. I don't even have the words. Not only is a baby being sacrificed, but what can be scarier than living your life with all of these expectations because of your gender, you know? I think that is fucking terrifying because I live it. And the way that the film is so beautifully, by the way, put together, you know, like visually and with music, I think that there's no fucking way you can say, like, this wasn't meant to scare you, or at least create this like sense of unnervous, or no, unnerve you anyway.
You've cursed this family.
Who's there?
I'm upset.
No. you have every right to be, much like Thomason. And I think even though the baby sacrifice thing is rough, and I obviously cannot condone it even for a protagonist, but I think I like the idea of like all that she has to sacrifice in order to gain that freedom, you know, and like it does cost every little bit of her family's sanity and possibly even her own as she starts cackling when she rises up above the flames with her coven. But I don't think sanity is defining of happiness or tragedy either. I think it's more complicated than that. So you really won me over with this. But also, yeah, if you don't think a baby getting smashed into like a jelly in the first 15 minutes qualifies as horror, I'm genuinely afraid of you. Because what the fuck?
I'm gonna go ahead and say even if that scene wasn't in the movie, I would still qualify it as a horror. I know not many people are gonna agree with me here, because of course there are so many movies that are not horror that use these aesthetic techniques and, you know, like certain structures. But I do think a lot of it has to do with like what the intention of the filmmaker is. Obviously with the score like we have in The Witch, it is there to create tension, to create suspense, to create this like really uncomfortable feeling inside of you that you cannot say is like in a drama. I don't know. I think it's just clear, and I think people are just afraid of calling something so polished and so well done a horror movie.
Yeah,
and they have been for years.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, because a fun fact, Robert Eggers originally did not want to use a score for The Witch, and I believe this was his directorial debut. And when he was putting the film together, he was like, okay, I'm not that talented, I need a score. I don't want to overdo it though, and I don't think the score overdoes it at all. I think it really gets under your skin, like the guitar plucking and the violin strings, and like I'll never forget the image of after the baby jelly, the witch rubbing it all over her, and she just walks out into the moon with the trees hanging overhead. Like that image, the first time I saw that, I was like, okay, I'm not sleeping right when I get home. I'm gonna wait a little bit.
You're gonna clean up your nosebleed.
Oh, yeah, I gotta clean up my nosebleed first. Because also, fun fact, my room, around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, the moon shoots directly through my curtains. And it's the scariest fucking thing in the world after The Witch. So I think, yeah, the music really helps incorporate that. But also, I think, just to expand on the point you made, it's in what the film and the filmmakers are interested in, like, exploring. Because, I mean, something like Near Dark, one of my favorite films, or Alien, those are, like, straight horror. And there's nothing really, like, overtly scary to me in those. Like, Alien never scared me. Ever. But I think it's a perfect film also. And I know people that are terrified of it, but it's what the film's exploring about, like, capitalism and gender and the fear of it's rape. It's a giant rape parable, basically. It's very explicitly horrific stuff that it's exploring. Near Dark is nothing nearly as vicious, but it's also about like life that you can't have as a vampire, and like that longing and that dread of not being able to live something as something human. that's horrifying.
Right.
It's not overtly scary in your face like The Witch might be, or Us, or even Get Out. I don't think is nearly as scary as something like Us, but it's still a movie about people getting their brains transplanted out of their bodies. And if that's not horror, I mean, it's also clearly about like race and stuff, but also brains getting taken out of people's bodies. That's not normal.
Exactly.
So
I mean, if we're like looking at the literal things that happen, even just the literal things are fucking terrifying. Like you said, the brains being swapped. But even the racial commentary and like the social commentary is fucking scary, especially at the time that Get Out came out, when we had all of this tension. It came out into 2016, 2017?
Yeah, like right after, like a month after the inauguration. It was like February.
Exactly.
So like coming off the cuff of the Trump inauguration, that's saying some shit, because it's not just pointing fingers at like the overt racism. It's pointing fingers at liberal, like, hello, how do you do, fellow black men? Like kind of racism.
Yeah.
And that's
exactly
something that's harder to address, and especially at that time, it's not something you think we need to talk about, but it's absolutely also exactly what we need to still be talking about.
I mean, and Us is a perfect example of that as well. So, I mean, how could you say that that's not horror just because it's not scary to you, or you don't think that they used, conventionally scary techniques like jump scares or specific like supernatural forces or something? I don't know. I think, again, fear is subjective, but also even if you cannot relate to somebody else being scared of this movie, you can kind of determine that it's a horror movie based on just like what the intention of the film is.
Yeah, and you brought up another good point too about like even if the baby smashing scene wasn't in The Witch, it's still horror, not just because of the witch stuff, but because of the commentary it has about being a woman in a society that doesn't allow you to be anything other than what they tell you to be. It's...
And, like, that could have easily been put in a drama. Or, I could probably name a few drama films where, like, that is the theme. But, again, what separates The Witch from that is just how fucking uncomfortable and, like, uneasy I feel watching it because of these... like, it's kind of like when you're writing a book. I always think about Edgar Allan Poe, because when I read Edgar Allan Poe, I imagine this like dreary scene with like really, really subdued but like unnerving music, and I feel like The Witch is a film version of that.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I feel like we have to have some value here when it comes to aesthetics, like even if it's beyond the content of the film to me, which is why I think Gone Girl I would classify as a horror movie, because it looks like one to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean that might just be David Fincher being like, everything is awful all the time, but I'm gonna make a masterpiece out of it anyways.
I know nobody's gonna agree with me on that. I'm like, oh, a horror movie is determined by the way it looks, but obviously there are other elements. But I think there is something very intentionally done in these movies in terms of like atmosphere and tone that are undeniably put there to be seen as horrific or just as a horror movie.
I can roll with that. I think even stuff like, again, Us and Get Out, I'm sorry, they're in the forefront of my mind. I haven't stopped thinking about them. It's ruining my life. But their daytime sequences, they're not shot in like the way something like The Witch is. Like I promise I'll turn back around and to approve, like agreeing with your point. But like they're framed not like horror films initially, even though they absolutely definitely are horror films and exploring very horrific circumstances and like commentaries. But I think it's an extension of how they're presented, as well as like what they're trying to present. So like in terms of like color palette, David Fincher uses like that really low lighting, a lot of green always, which might be very like off-putting to some people, but I kind of love it. Everything looks like ugly in a beautiful way. And,
it looks grimy.
Yeah, and I mean, Gone Girl is basically a horror movie about how if you're not honest in your marriage, your guys are gonna eat each other, and your guys are gonna be stuck with each other forever.
Also, I feel like Gone Girl is another good one where, like, the pressure to be a certain way for her, like the cool girl thing, totally just made her... I mean, it's like an extreme version of this, obviously, but just she couldn't put up with it anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what David Fincher's and Gillian Flynn say with that script in the film ultimately is like, you know, I way back in 2014 when I was writing for Audiences Everywhere, R.I.P. to that site, but I listed her as one of the best film villains of 2014, and I still kind of stand by that, but really it should be a doubleheader, because she was turned into that by her family, her marriage, society.
The standards, right, society in general. Like, she had to be a certain way to maintain the attention and affection of her terrible husband. I think Gone Girl does a good job at showing, like, both sides, but I do not consider her to be a villain. I don't think she's the villain in the movie. I think, like, the world around her is.
Yeah, I'm more on board with that now too. Like, I guess I would say it's a double header because for the film, I would say she's the antagonist, but she's not a villain. Even though Ben Affleck's character is the protagonist, he's definitely not a hero. It is very clear that he is a dick, at the very least. An awful husband.
But he's also not the villain. So it's like, who is the villain? And that's what I fucking love Gone Girl. I know this is not a Gone Girl podcast.
No, Gone Girl is the shit. I could talk about David Fincher forever.
But I mean, like, who is the villain? And that is so scary to me. Is it not? Is it not? Like, who is going to be held accountable for the shitty relationships that happen because of certain standards or certain pressures that are put on both parties in the relationship, you know?
Yeah. And to bring it back to The Witch, the father is not the antagonist, but maybe not even fully villainous, but he's a bad father for sure. And like, but also at the same time, if we're looking at the grander picture that made Thomason break free from all this too, you know, like what other choice did these people have given the way that they were raised, you know, like before all of this, you know, and like how is that gonna, like, how are they allowed to choose anything else? And I think there's a tragedy in that. Definitely.
And I completely was about to say that. I was about to say this. The thing about this that is tragic is not like everybody dies. It's just like the suffering that everybody has to go through as a result of a decision made by the figurehead of the home. Because those poor children, especially her little brother, that scene where he's having like the weird possession is really scary and sad to me, just because he didn't really deserve it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's just like how old is he? Like 9, maybe 8?
Yeah, like 9, 10.
Yeah, he's just a little boy.
Exactly, but I do, and again, I don't think the dad is, I wouldn't say he's the villain, but I do think he is the accountable party for what is happening, because he's definitely proud. He's got this toxic masculine pride that keeps him from either going back. Well, I guess they got banished, but but you know, there are ways to fix this. And like there was even a conversation between him and his wife where she was like, please do something, like, we cannot be here anymore. So that pride kept him from doing anything besides chopping wood, which is the most masculine activity that was probably available to him. So he exercised his masculinity by being proud and doing that chopping wood that was useless, and everyone else had to pay the consequences of that. And I think that is so representative of life.
Yeah, I mean, to bring it back to a little more real stuff, I mean, like, you're Cuban, I'm Mexican, but it's machismo is a very unfortunate common thing in a lot of men in our cultures, and it's like it's so ingrained that it feels weird to call it out, even, you know, like.
Yes, exactly.
Like, I mean, I don't know often this happens to you, but like I see it just like with other relatives of mine, even, and friends, where you know, if the woman has to go get a plate of food for the men, like that's just how it is, you know, like that's how that's always been. And
I mean, and it's interesting that you said that. It's so deeply ingrained in us that we can't even call it out, because it's just like, I don't even call it out. And you know, I mean, anyone who knows me or follows me on Twitter will know I'm very loud about unacceptable behavior from men. But in my own like upbringing and family, I feel like I can't say anything just because that Latino part of me is just used to it, and this is just my, like, this is just how it's always been, and I don't know anything else, so how can I even argue anything else, you know?
Yeah.
It's fucked up. This was a downer, but
I'm so sorry that we went this direction.
But you know, that's why this is such a cathartic movie to me. I know a lot of people find, especially sexual assault survivors, find, you know, rape revenge films to be very cathartic, and I think this would be kind of my version of that. I feel very, very okay when I watch The Witch, which sounds crazy and like undateable across my forehead, but but it's true. I mean, it's very true.
No, I mean, I've always had positive feelings about this movie, but I think after the second viewing is when I started getting more complicated about it, where I was like, it's not like I had to open up my fucking male perspective that was all closed off. Like, hang on, is it not sad? Is it uplifting? Is it happier? Because she seems happy there, and like my brain was like hardwiring, just trying to like figure out like, why is this? What are you doing? And this conversation
Why am I
really,
feeling like this?
this conversation really helped me open up to all that too. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I kind of feel like I'm being all over the place. It's so much that I want to say about it, and I mean, I don't think it was an accident that this is one of the most feminist films we've gotten in a very, very long time. And to think it was made by a man, like, that's awesome. And in that podcast I mentioned earlier that I was on, I said the same thing. I feel like a lot of some of the most feminist films we're getting lately are by men. And I think that's awesome, because to me, it makes me feel like more men are starting to understand where we're coming from. Like Suspiria, the remake, for example, I love that movie. I think it's extremely feminist. I think it has some extremely feminist things to say, and it's made by a dude. So that's, I mean, right on with that.
Yeah, I think that's we went to a downer place for a second there, but I think we can end on a positive note as we wind down the episode, in that, yeah, it is more commonplace in art, thankfully. And I think even though it is harder and not as common to see it called out maybe in our own lives, but I think just in general as a society, we're pushing forward in a good way. Still too slow, but I think the open-mindedness is kind of, it's reaching new heights that it just never had before. And I'm not saying The Witch is specifically to thank for that, but I think it is a part of that, and I couldn't be happier about it. And also, Robert Eggers has a new movie coming out this year, apparently, called The Lighthouse.
Oh my goodness.
So I don't know if it'll be as good as this or as feminist as this, but I'm really looking forward to it now.
Yeah, I'm not really of like the camp that men shouldn't tell women's stories. I think that if you have input and you have like a specific kind of like representation in the film, then I think that's perfectly fine, especially if you're telling an authentic or like real experience, you know. Mm-hmm. So I love this movie. I cannot wait for his next movie. And if you have not seen this movie, do not talk to me until you do. I have some friends that I know in my Almost Famous episode, I said the same thing, but like I have friends that have seen this and are like, I hate this. This is, again, back to the original purpose of this episode. they think it's like too slow, or oh my god, this was such a slow burn. Ugh. And I'm like, oh god, I hate that word, because every time somebody says it, it's like to say that it was boring, you know? Yeah. So it's not really the phrase's fault. It's just the people that use it incorrectly. But it's a bummer because this is a real work of art. It's perfect. I wouldn't change anything about it.
Yeah, I don't think I would either. It's such a fucking fantastic movie. It was definitely one of my favorites, if not my favorite, the year it came out. 2016, right? So no, never mind. Kubo and Moonlight came out that year, but it's up there. It's up there.
I think this came out earlier. I think this was 2015.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, then you know what? Maybe. Oh, no. Fury Road and Creed, but that's a personal thing. This totally deserves to be mentioned alongside those. It is totally one of the better horror films, or uplifting horror films, as we've discussed now.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that a crazy thing to call it? I love it.
Yeah, I mean, Suspiria is kind of like that too. So I mean, there's more of it happening, and it feels good. Very unconventional, uplifting, as we've discussed as well. And on the last topic of slow burn, before I let you go take on the world, what if we have to decide right now? We can figure this out for the rest of our podcasting lives, but also for right now, what should we strive to call moderately paced horror? Just moderately paced? Should we strive for something else in particular?
So here's, I think, the distinction. I'm about to get English major on you.
No, please, by all means.
When you call something a slow burn, that I feel like that has become a noun, right? So now you're putting a label on the film, whereas if you're calling it moderately paced, you're describing the film. Mm-hmm. So I feel like, I don't know, I find it very strange to make slow burn kind of like its own genre. You know what I mean? It's I don't know, I think just calling it moderately paced would be fine.
Okay. I mean, you're opening me up to perspectives today is what's happening here. So I'm just trying to ease into this, because again, I'm not an expert horror guy or anything.
I mean, it's like totally a me thing. I don't think anyone else has a problem with the phrase. And again, I don't have the problem with the phrase. I just have a problem with people using it to call something boring. And it happens so often. At least in my real life. Online, obviously, or on Twitter, where the horror community kind of just understands that slow burn just means that something is a super moderately paced film. That's different. But oh Christ, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it in real life where people are like, that was such a slow burn. I hated it.
No, I mean, I get where you're coming from, because again, that's why I brought up the whole other thing about is it really a horror film? Just these ridiculous qualifiers for films that fit into one giant umbrella of a genre. It's just let it be its own thing. It doesn't need to fit into any other parameters.
Right. I would just like to say also, genres can overlap. You can have a film be more than one genre. So Alien, for example, that's a horror sci-fi film to me.
Yeah.
You can have both. It's not mutually exclusive. So I think people have a really hard time accepting that, because people like to live in a world of dichotomies. But let's just kind of be more open to understanding that.
And if I may, I also think it comes down to maybe a little bit of elitism too. People are kind of, they shy away from horror. Horror gets the short end of the stick. People complain about superhero movies a little bit too much, I think, but horror gets it way worse, where it's it's not really horror. Alien's more of a sci-fi, if you ask me. The Witch is a little more psychological, if you look at it from this perspective.
I know this is running a little bit long, but I have to say this because I feel like people that are familiar with this discourse will appreciate it. But in one of my film classes 2 years ago, I had this debate in front of the whole class with my professor because I just couldn't take it anymore. He said that Alien was a sci-fi, and I was like, what the fuck? Why? And so he put it this way, and I do not agree with this, but maybe it's food for thought. I hated this. I'm so sorry. But he goes, the existence of an alien is not deniable. It's possible. We don't know that it's impossible for an alien to exist, so that's why it's sci-fi. Whereas a vampire, and then he pointed at my little vampire tattoo to humiliate me.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Cannot exist. So that's why, like, a vampire movie would be considered a horror movie and Alien should be considered a sci-fi, which was an interesting point, but also, fuck you. Like, that's, the genres can overlap again.
Yeah, I like your approach on that. It sounds like your professor's kind of an asshole.
I actually really liked him, but at that point I wanted to die because he was like belittling horror, you know, like that's why he was trying to embarrass me for sure. Everyone knows, like, in every single class I've ever been in that was a film class, I am not shy about how much I love it, and I get like made fun of for it all the time. It's so fucked up and so representative of how people approach the genre, and it's bullshit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It sounds like you should be slashing some tires. That's what it sounds like.
I mean, I'm a good sport, and it's just funny to me at this point.
I mean, they're objectively
they're
wrong,
missing out.
you know, so.
Oh, 100%. They're like missing out, so I'm more for me.
Yeah, it's sad for them. Oh well. Alejandra, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for taking more time to discuss another movie you really loved. Where can the people find you?
So you can find me on Twitter at sick__66, and I have my own podcast. It's at Sequels, SEEQUELS. We talk about direct-to-video sequels. It's under the Talk Film Society network, and my first piece ever is going to go up on Talk Film Society very, very soon.
All right, thank you again for joining me. If you like this episode, like and subscribe on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes. If you didn't like this, like and subscribe anyways, because you might find something you do like. Check out the Patreon, where you can support me so I can do more of these more often, get better sound equipment, get more guests, have more time to do this, yada, yada, yada. Links down below in the description to everything we talked about below. We have been professionally unprofessional.
Oh God, my Lord, I now begin. Oh, help me and don't leave my sin. For I repentant now shall be. From evil I will turn to thee. None ever shall destroy my faith. For I repentant now shall be. Oh God, my Lord, I now begin. Oh, help me and don't leave my sin. For I repentant now shall be. From evil I will turn to thee.
Let us leave the wood.